year 1917. While the world burned in the First World War, the British Empire controlled more than a quarter of all the land on the planet. A territory so vast that if you placed it on a map, you could cover all of Africa, all of South America, and still have room to spare. 33 million square kilometers under a single flag. 500 million people who woke up every morning as subjects of a king who lived in London and whom most would never see in their lives. It was the greatest empire humanity had ever built, and it was the work of an island in northern Europe that is not even 250,000, where 50 kilometers. The British Empire did not begin with a plan for global conquest. It began with desperation, greed, and the discovery that the ocean was not a limit but a path. And it ended the same way every empire that has ever existed on Earth has ended, collapsing from within while believing it was still invincible. This is the story of how a small, gray, rainy island in the North Atlantic managed to dominate the world for 300 years, and how it lost it all in less than 50. In the 15th century, England was a nobody. Spain had Columbus. Portugal had Vasco da Gama. France had the Mediterranean England. England had rain, sheep's wool, and an economy that depended on selling textiles to the Dutch. English kings looked toward the European continent with a mixture of envy and frustration, while the Iberians divided the world among themselves. The Atlantic was foreign territory, the Mediterranean was foreign territory, and the routes to Asia, where spices worth more than gold were found, were in the hands of others. The situation changed on August 5, 1497. A Venetian sailor named Giovanni Caboto, whom the English called John Cabot, set sail from Bristol with a single ship and 21 men. King Henry VII had given him permission, but not enough money for a royal fleet. It was a half-hearted expedition to discover a northern passage to Asia that no one knew for certain existed. Cabot never reached Asia. What he found was the coast of what is now Canada, or possibly Newfoundland, and he disembarked, planted the English flag, observed the forest, and returned home. He found no gold, no spices, no civilization. Willing to trade. He found trees, seabirds, and waters full of cod. But King Henry gave him 10 pounds and sent him back. The following year, Cabot set sail again in 1498 with 5 ships and disappeared. No one ever knew exactly what happened to them. But the first English contact with the New World was made, and the seed of something huge had been planted in frozen soil. For the next 100 years, England kept watching. The Spanish were building empires in America. They extracted silver from the Potosi mines in mind-boggling amounts and sent fleets laden with riches across the Atlantic. The English had no capacity to compete. What they could do was steal. And that is what they did for decades, with remarkable efficiency. English pirates, or privateers as they called them to sound more dignified, raided Spanish ships in the Caribbean with the tacit or explicit permission of the Crown. Francis Drake was the most famous in 1507. Drake set sail from Plymouth with 5 ships and the blessing of Queen Elizabeth I. What followed was one of the most audacious voyages in naval history. Drake crossed the Atlantic, passed through the Strait of Magellan, and reached the Pacific. where the Spanish never expected to see an English flag. He looted ports in Chile and Peru. He continued north to what is now California. He crossed the Pacific, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and returned to Plymouth in September 1580. He had completed the second circumnavigation of the globe after Magellan. The most important thing was not the feat itself, it was the cargo. Drake arrived with ships so laden with silver and spices stolen from the Spanish that the total value exceeded half of the English crown's annual income. Elizabeth I went personally to Plymouth to board his ship and knight him right there on the deck. The Spanish were quick to demand the return of the loot and the punishment of the pirate. Elizabeth said she didn't know what they were talking about. That moment perfectly summarizes how English foreign policy worked in the 16th century. Bold, cynical, profitable, and always wrapped in a layer of official respectability that no one believed. What Drake had proven was not just that the Spanish were vulnerable, it was that the ocean, for those who dared to cross and master it, was a mine of limitless wealth. And that changed the English mindset permanently. The Crown began to see the sea not as a danger, but as an investment. The difference between England and Spain at this point was significant. Spain managed its colonies as direct extensions of the Crown with royal officials, who answered to the king. England, which had much less money and much less central control, opted for a different model. It let private enterprise do it. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth signed the founding charter of the East India Company, It was a private company, with government permission to trade with Asia. It could negotiate its own treaties, maintain its own army, and declare war if deemed necessary to protect its commercial interests. It was, in modern terms, a corporation with sovereign powers. Nothing like it had ever existed before in history. And that company, more than any English king or admiral, was what built the British Empire. The East India Company's first fleet set sail in the year 1601 with 4 ships. It took almost 2 years to return, but it came back laden with spices from Indonesia at a huge profit on the initial investment. The shareholders in London could hardly believe it. Trade with Asia was real, it was possible, and it was fabulously profitable. More fleets followed, more routes were opened. The company established its first factories in India, first in Surat, in 1608. And it gradually expanded its presence city by city, treaty by treaty. But India was a huge and complex continent governed by a mosaic of kingdoms and sultanates with their own power structures. The Mughal Empire, which at the time was one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated states on the planet, saw the English merchants as what they were, minor businessmen who needed permission to operate. And for a time, that is exactly what they were. The company's representatives at the Mughal court bowed to the emperor and offered gifts. They negotiated with humility. In that first stage, there was no illusion of superiority. The English were guests begging for trading rights. What changed everything was a combination of factors that developed over decades. Deeds. The Mughal Empire began to weaken from within. The emperors after Aurangzeb, who died in 1707, did not have his capacity or his authority. Wars of succession, internal religious conflicts, and regional rebellions were fragmenting central power. Meanwhile, the East India Company kept growing. It built fortresses in its trading cities. It hired local soldiers, the sepoys, to protect its facilities. It accumulated military power almost imperceptibly. No one in that first period pointed out the exact moment when the English merchants stopped asking for permission and started making decisions. It happened gradually, and by the time anyone noticed, it was already too late. The Battle of Plassey in June 1757 is the moment historians usually point to as the turning point. Robert Clive, a company employee who had become a soldier out of necessity rather than vocation, faced the Nawab of Bengal with an army of 3,000 soldiers, of which less than a third were European. The Nawab had 50,000 men, and yet he lost. He lost because half of his own army had been bribed in advance by Clive, who mixed corrupt diplomacy with tactical violence with an ease that revealed something about the man's character and the project he represented. Bengal, the richest region in the subcontinent, fell under the control of a private London company. And from that day on, India ceased to be a place where the English did business and became a place where the English ruled. What the company did in Bengal over the following years was one of the most systematic wealth extractions in human history. Taxes were tripled. The lands of farmers who had worked the same soil for generations were confiscated without compensation. The money collected was not invested in local infrastructure, but sent directly to London. In the 1770s, the Bengal famine killed up to 12 million people. The monsoon had failed and harvests were poor. But what turned a natural crisis into a massive catastrophe was that the company continued collecting taxes during the famine. Peasants who had no money because they had no harvest lost their lands. Those who lost their land could not plant the following year. The cycle fed itself until entire families simply disappeared. In London, shareholders collected their dividends that year. While India fell under English control in the East, something completely different was happening on the other side of the planet. The problem with the American colonies was not that the English ruled them badly, though they did that too. The problem was that the American colonists had developed in 100 years an identity of their own that no longer fit being subjects of a distant crown. The Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed taxes on all legal documents and publications in the colonies, unleashed a political storm the Crown failed to read. The colonists' argument was simple. We cannot be taxed by a parliament in which we have no representation. To the English in London, that argument was insolent. To the colonists in Boston, it was a matter of principle. In December 73, a group of colonists disguised as indigenous people boarded 3 East India Company ships in Boston Harbor and threw 42 tons of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was not an act of popular spontaneity, but an operation planned by activists who perfectly understood the symbolism of what they were doing. Tea was the most visible product of imperial trade, and destroying it publicly was a political statement as clear as any speech. King George III and Parliament responded with the Coercive Acts, which closed Boston Harbor and revoked Massachusetts' autonomy. It was exactly the wrong response. Instead of isolating the radicals, it unified the colonies around the idea of resistance. In April 1705, the war lasted 8 years and they lost. The 1783 Treaty of Paris recognized the independence of the United States. For the British Empire, it was the greatest blow it had received up to that point. 13 colonies, over 2 million square kilometers, decades of investment and infrastructure, all lost. In London, some thought it was the end of the imperial project. They were wrong. The loss of America accelerated something that was already underway. If settler colonies of white people claiming English rights were a source of conflict, the alternative was to build a different empire based not on colonizing territories for Europeans to inhabit, but on the commercial and military domination of territories that already had their own populations. India was the model, and that model would be exported. The 19th century was the century of the British Empire in a way that no other era in history had known. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the factories of Manchester and Birmingham in the final decades of the 18th century, gave Britain such a massive technological edge over the rest of the world that it fundamentally changed the rules of power. Steamships could travel up rivers that sailboats could not. Breech-loading rifles fired faster and further than any weapon an African or Asian army could oppose them with. Locomotives could move troops and supplies at speeds impossible for animals, and telegraphs allowed a general in India to communicate with London in hours instead of months. Technological superiority didn't explain the empire on its own, but it did explain why the conquests of the 19th century were faster and cheaper than any prior conquest. In many cases, a handful of British soldiers with modern weaponry could defeat local armies 10 times their size. And when force was not enough, the threat of force was sufficient. The British Empire, at its Victorian peak, operated on a mix of real and implied violence that rarely needed to be explicit because everyone knew what it was capable of. In Africa, the history was especially fast and especially brutal. For centuries, Europeans had maintained a presence on the African coast, primarily for the slave trade, which Great Britain officially abolished in 1807 and began actively intercepting in the Atlantic. But the interior of the continent was unknown territory to Europeans. Tropical diseases, especially malaria, meant that any expedition into the interior had a high probability of ending the lives of those who embarked. Quinine changed that. When colonial doctors discovered that quinine prevented malaria, the interior of Africa suddenly opened up to European exploration, and what explorers found were enormous territories with abundant natural resources and societies that had no way to militarily resist industrial powers. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, European powers sat at a table and carved up Africa as if it were a cake. Great Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and Spain drew lines on a map without consulting any Africans, without respecting tribal or historical borders, and without any of those drawing those lines. Ever having visited most of the territories they were dividing. In less than 20 years, practically the entire African continent was under European control. Great Britain took the largest and wealthiest pieces, including Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Rhodesia, and a column of territory that, in the most ambitious plans, was meant to connect Cairo to the Cape of Good Hope from north to south, crossing the entire continent. Egypt is a perfect example of how British imperialism worked when it didn't want to be called imperialism. In 1875, the Khedive of Egypt, Ismail, was on the verge of bankruptcy after years of uncontrolled spending on the country's modernization. To pay his debts, he sold Egypt's shares in the recently opened Suez Canal. British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli bought those shares on behalf of the British government with a personal loan from the Rothschild family because Parliament was not in session and there was no time to wait. £4 million. Within 48 hours, Great Britain became the largest shareholder of the canal, which connected the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, the most important artery of global trade. Officially, Egypt remained an independent country governed by its Khedive. In practice, Egyptian finances were under British and French supervision. And when the debt continued to grow and a nationalist revolt broke out in 1882, British warships bombarded Alexandria and soldiers entered Cairo. Egypt did not officially become a British protectorate until 1914. For 32 years before that, Great Britain governed it de facto without calling it a colony, because calling it a colony would have complicated diplomatic relations. This type of euphemism was an empire specialty. India, meanwhile, had gone from being the property of a private company to being the property of the British Crown after one of the most traumatic episodes of the 19th century. In May 1857, the Sepoys, Indian soldiers serving the East India Company, revolted in Mirutu. The spark was ostensibly technical. The new Enfield rifle cartridges were lubricated with animal fat, and soldiers had to bite them to load the weapon. For Hindu Sepoys, cow fat was sacrilegious. For Muslims, pork fat was impure. The story is not as simple as an ammunition problem. Decades of accumulated grievances, displacement of local rulers by English officers, land confiscation, and the destruction of traditional social structures had created a tension that only needed a spark. The rebellion spread through northern and central India with a speed that left the English stunned. In Kanpur, the rebels captured 211 English women and children and executed them as rescue troops approached. In Delhi, the rebels proclaimed the last Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah, Zafar, restorer of the empire. The British response when they regained control was extraordinarily violent. The leaders of the rebellion were tied to cannons and fired upon. English soldiers burned villages and executed suspects en masse without trial. The retaliation was in every sense a demonstration of the kind of brutality the empire was capable of deploying when it felt its rule was threatened. What changed after the rebellion was the structure of power. The British government dissolved the East India Company, which in its nearly 260 years of existence had gone from being a trading company to a de facto sovereign power over 300 million people. Beginning in 1858, India was governed directly by the Crown. Queen Victoria became Empress of India in 1876. And the project of administering the subcontinent from London became the most ambitious colonial management project the world had ever seen. The British Raj, as the direct rule over India was called, built 70,000 kilometers of railroad, created a unified postal system, established universities and legal codes, and transformed the infrastructure of the subcontinent in ways that are still visible today. Defenders of the empire point to these achievements as evidence that colonization was not just extraction, but also construction. It is an argument that deserves a precise response. The railroads in India were not built to benefit the Indians. They were built to move troops and extract resources to the ports. The cities connected by the first railway lines were port cities because the goal was to get raw materials out to Great Britain and bring English manufactured goods into India. The Indian economy, which before colonization produced between a quarter and a third of global wealth, was systematically reduced as local textiles were destroyed by competition from cheaper English goods. English goods. The weavers of Bengal, who had been world-renowned for the fineness of their muslins, lost their markets. In a few decades, Indian cotton traveled to the factories of Manchester, was turned into cloth and returned to India as a finished product at a price local artisans could not compete with. The deindustrialization of India was systematic and directly benefited the English industry. But the 19th century was not just conquest. It was also the era when the British Empire built the ideological architecture that allowed it to view itself as a benevolent project. The civilizing mission, as they called it, was the idea that non-European peoples were inherently inferior and needed the tutelage of white men to develop. The poet Rudyard Kipling expressed this with memorable crudeness in his 1899 poem when he described the dominion over non-European peoples as the white man's burden. The idea was not new, but Kipling articulated it with a clarity that resonated with the English ruling class, because it gave them a moral vocabulary for something that, in its barest terms, was simply the violent appropriation of others' wealth. If colonizing India, Africa, or the Pacific was a service that the English provided to peoples incapable of governing themselves, then there was no contradiction between being the most powerful empire in history and simultaneously considering itself a Christian, liberal, and humane civilization. The tension between rhetoric and reality did not disappear, but the discourse was persuasive enough that generations of Englishmen educated in the country's public schools could embrace both the gospel and the rifle. The empire, at its Victorian peak, was also a global trade network without precedent. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. London's financial market set the prices for raw materials from across the planet. American cotton, Malayan rubber, South African gold, Bengali jute, Ceylonese tea, Ghanaian cocoa. They all passed through London trading houses, they were all quoted, on the London Stock Exchange, and they all generated commissions and profits for the city. The empire was, among other things, the greatest project of economic extraction humanity had ever conceived, operating with an efficiency that made the costs of maintaining colonial order seem modest compared to the profits. It was not always like that. There were colonial wars that proved enormously costly and called the profitability of the imperial project into question. The Boer War in South Africa from 1899 to 1902 was the most traumatic of that generation. The Boers were descendants of Dutch settlers who had arrived in South Africa in the 17th century and had developed their own identity, language, and culture over 2 centuries. When gold was discovered in their territories in 1886, tensions with English settlers who also claimed South Africa as their own became unsustainable. The war that broke out in 1899 showed the English something they did not expect. The Boers, numbering fewer than 250,000 fighters in total, resisted for nearly 3 years against an imperial army that reached nearly 500,000 soldiers. They did so using guerrilla tactics, knowing the terrain, and with a determination that the world's most powerful army could not easily crush. What the English did to break the resistance was to create the first modern concentration camps. They gathered Boer families, women, children, and the elderly into camps enclosed by wire where conditions were so poor that between 20,000 and 25,000 people, mostly children, died of disease and malnutrition. News of the camps caused horror in Europe and in Great Britain itself. Journalist Emily Hobhouse published a detailed report on the conditions that sparked a furious parliamentary debate. For a segment of the English public, it was the first time the empire's methods became fully visible at home. Henry Campbell Bannerman's Liberal Party called what was happening in the camps methods of barbarism. The Conservative government won the election anyway. When the war ended with the Treaty of Vereeniging in May 1902, Great Britain had won South Africa, but had displayed its methods to the world in a way that could no longer be ignored. The empire was at its greatest territorial extent, but cracks were beginning to appear that, in retrospect, were unmistakable signs of what was to come. The first crack was economic. Germany and the United States had industrialized at speeds that threatened English manufacturing supremacy. In 1870, produced a third of all the world's manufactured goods. By 1909, that figure had dropped to less than a fifth. The Germans were making better steel. The Americans were producing more oil and more automobiles. The technological advantage that had sustained the empire for a century was eroding. The second rift was political in India. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, originally with the support of liberal British officials who believed educated Indians should have a voice in their own government, became progressively radicalized. The initial demands were moderate: more positions in the civil administration, more consultation before laws were passed. But as the British government ignored or postponed those demands, the idea that India could and should govern itself gained ground. The third rift was the most unexpected: war. On August 4, 1914, Great Britain declared war on Germany. That automatically meant that India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and all other colonial territories were also at war. No one asked them. 1.5 million Indian soldiers served in the Imperial Army. During the First World War, they died in Flanders, Mesopotamia, Gallipoli, and the deserts of Palestine, fighting wars that weren't theirs, for an empire that vaguely promised rewards after the war. The rewards were scarce. The Rowlatt Act of 1919, which extended the powers of detention without trial that had been used during the war, was the government's immediate response to the hopes of Indian nationalists. The Indian response was mass mobilization, and the name that became the symbol of that mobilization was that of a London-trained lawyer who had returned from South Africa with ideas about unarmed resistance that were going to change the 20th century, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. On April 13, 1919, one of the darkest episodes in the history of the empire in India occurred. In the city of Amritsar, in the Punjab, thousands of Indians had gathered in an enclosed garden called Jallianwala Bagh to celebrate the Baisakhi festival and hear political speeches. General Reginald Dyer arrived with 50 Gurkha and Sikh soldiers, blocked the only wide exit, and without any prior warning ordered them to fire. The soldiers fired for 10 minutes into the crowd, The exact figures are disputed, but the most careful estimates speak of between 375 and 1,000 people dead and more than 1,000 wounded. Dyer was relieved of his command but was not prosecuted. The British Parliament debated the case for days. The House of Lords defended him. The Morning Post opened a public subscription to recognize his services and raised over £26,000 from sympathizers who saw in Dyer the man who had saved India from revolution. In India, the effect was the exact opposite of what Dyer intended. Amritsar convinced millions who still doubted that the British Empire was unreformable and that independence was not an aspiration, but a necessity. Gandhi, who until that moment had believed in the possibility of working within the imperial system to reform it from within, abandoned that position of British rule over India. Meanwhile, the empire was expanding in the Middle East in ways that would create problems throughout the rest of the 20th century and beyond. During the First World War, British diplomats made contradictory promises to different interested parties regarding the future of the Ottoman Empire's Arab territories. Sharif Hussein of Mecca was promised support for the creation of an independent Arab state if he rose up against the Ottomans. While he did so, in November 1917, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent a letter to the leader of the British Jewish community, Lord Walter Rothschild, expressing the government's support for the creation of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which was then Ottoman territory. The Balfour Declaration, consisting of a single paragraph, did not consult either the Arabs inhabiting Palestine or the leaders of the Arab movement who had been promised independence. When the war ended and the Ottoman Empire disintegrated, Great Britain and France carved up the Middle East with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, drawing borders of nations that did not exist over territories they did not know, installing kings and emirs in artificial countries and leaving behind the seeds of conflicts that have yet to end. Iraq, Transjordan, Palestine, everything fell under a British mandate, which in practice meant colonies by another name. The Second World War was the moment when the British Empire was saved from being destroyed by the Axis powers and, simultaneously, signed its own death warrant. In September 1939, when Great Britain declared war on Germany, the Empire was still formally the largest in the world, but the economic and military reality was very different from 40 years earlier. The Great Depression of the 1930s had devastated the country's finances. German rearmament had forced massive investments in defense that the state treasury could barely sustain, and the debt from the First World War, much of which was owed to the United States, remained largely unpaid. When Germany invaded France in May 1940 and the British Army had to evacuate through Dunkirk, leaving behind almost all its weaponry, it became clear that Great Britain could not win this war alone. What Churchill did in that summer of 1940, it was probably the most important thing he did during the war. Persuading the British that they could resist when all material evidence suggested they could not. Churchill's speeches did not win the war. What won the war was the entry of the Soviet Union in June 1941, when Hitler invaded an ally of less than 2 years, and the entry of the United States in December of that year when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The debt Great Britain incurred with the United States to finance the war determined what would come next. The American Lend-Lease program saved the empire but dictated its future. Roosevelt was not a friend of British imperialism. The Atlantic Charter, signed in August 1941, included the right of peoples to choose their own form of government. Churchill tried to ensure that did not apply to the empire's colonies. Roosevelt made it clear that the Americans had fought partly for that principle, and that Great Britain could not be both a champion of freedom against Nazism and a defender of colonialism on a global scale, without a contradiction that Americans struggled to explain to their own electorate. And India was the first domino. Gandhi had been imprisoned many times during the war. The Quit India campaign of 1942, which called for the immediate withdrawal of the British, had been crushed with mass arrests. But when the war ended and Clement Attlee's Labour government arrived in July 1945, policy changed radically. Attlee and his ministers understood what the Conservatives could not admit: that Britain had no money, no political will, and no international support to maintain the empire by force. The solution was to withdraw with as much dignity as possible. The process in India was anything but dignified. Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy, was sent with a mandate to achieve a transfer of power within a year. That absurdly short deadline for a subcontinent of 300 million people divided among Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and dozens of minorities practically guaranteed chaos. The partition of India into two states, India and Pakistan, was announced in August 1947 with barely weeks of notice. The borders were drawn by an English lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India before arriving in July of that year. He had less than 6 weeks to draw the lines that would divide the Punjab and Bengal. The lines he drew separated families, cut off historical trade routes, divided cities, and created minorities trapped on the wrong side of borders that did not exist 4 months earlier. What followed was one of the largest population displacements in history. 12 to 15 million people crossed the new borders in both directions. Hindus and Sikhs fled toward India. Muslims fled toward Pakistan. On trains, on roads, in the fields, groups met and attacked each other with a violence that left between 200,000 and 2 million dead, depending on the source. The exact figure will never be known. Mountbatten had planned to leave on Independence Day and stay to oversee the transition. The scale of what happened left him speechless. The British left, leaving violence behind. In Africa, the process was slower but no less turbulent. In the Gold Coast, now Ghana, a politician named Kwame Nkrumah had returned from studying in the US and Britain with ideas about Pan-Africanism and independence that resonated with a population governed for decades by colonial administrators who treated the continent as an endless source of human and natural resources. Nkrumah was imprisoned by the British in 1951. He walked out of prison straight to becoming Prime Minister. It was the first time an African governed a sub-Saharan British colony. Ghana became independent in March 1957. The first country in sub-Saharan Africa to do so. It was the beginning of the tide. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan delivered a speech in February 1960 to the South African Parliament in Cape Town that captured better than any other what was happening. The wind of change is blowing through this continent, he said. The wind of change was actually a tsunami. In 1960-17, African countries gained independence within the span of 12 months. In 1961, more did so. By 1963, most of West and Central Africa, which had been part of the empire, was formally outside of it. The process was not peaceful in all cases. In Kenya, the Mau Mau Rebellion, which began in the early 50s, was crushed with methods that a 2013 government report formally acknowledged as torture, and brutalities that the British government had to admit, and for which it finally apologized and paid compensation to surviving victims. The model that repeated itself was always similar: local resistance, violent repression, growing political and economic cost for Britain, eventual negotiation independence. Time and money were against the empire. The Suez Crisis in October 1956 was the moment Great Britain discovered in the most public and humiliating way possible that it was no longer a great power capable of acting independently in the world. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in July of that year, Anthony Eden's government responded by secretly planning an invasion with France and Israel. The operation began on October 29, 1956. The Israelis entered the Sinai. French and British paratroopers descended on the canal. Militarily, it was an initial success. Politically, it was an absolute disaster. Eisenhower, the American president, called Eden furiously and demanded an immediate withdrawal. The Soviets threatened to intervene. The United Nations voted for withdrawal and, most devastatingly for Eden, the International Monetary Fund refused to grant an emergency loan to Great Britain until it withdrew its troops because the United States was blocking it. With the pound sterling falling in currency markets and the country on the verge of a payment crisis, Eden ordered a ceasefire on November 7. 3 weeks of operation, complete withdrawal. Eden resigned as prime minister in January of the following year. Ill and politically destroyed, the message to the world could not have been clearer. Great Britain could no longer act without Washington's permission. The empire that had dictated the world's terms for 2 centuries. Now it needed permission to use its own military forces. The world took note. The colonies took note even more. Hong Kong was the final symbolic act of imperial withdrawal. At midnight on July 1, 1997, before television cameras around the world, Prince Charles and the last British governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, attended the ceremony, in which the territory returned to China after 156 years under British administration. Rain soaked the ceremony as the red flag of China went up and the Union Jack came down. Patten, who had cried in private before the ceremony, kept his composure in public. The last British soldiers boarded their ships. The fleet left the port. The British Empire, which had begun with John Cabot planting a flag on icy ground in 1497, ended with a flag coming down in the rain in Hong Kong. The legacy of the British Empire is one of the liveliest and most difficult debates in contemporary history, precisely because it does not admit simple answers. The borderlines drawn by colonial administrators in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia created artificial states that have generated conflict for decades. The English educational system, exported to the colonies, produced generations of bilingual colonial elites who often ended up leading independence movements. Railroads built to extract resources became the backbone of independent national economies. The English legal system that was implanted in the colonial territories survived in many cases after independence because it was what the new elites knew. The English language became the global language of the 20th century, in part because the empire had sown it across every continent. The parliamentary institutions that Great Britain exported to its dominions worked in some cases, like Canada, Australia, India, and New Zealand, with notable stability, and failed spectacularly in others. The debt of the empire to the peoples it colonized is not abstract. It is measurable in the wealth extracted over centuries, in the industries destroyed, in the leaders executed, in the systems of knowledge and governance that were erased or marginalized. When economist Utsa Patnaik calculated in 2017 what Great Britain had extracted from India between 1600 and 1950, she arrived at a figure that its own methodological rigor made difficult to ignore. Approximately $45 trillion in current values. Whatever the exact accuracy of that figure, the order of magnitude speaks for itself. There is something more in the history of the empire that deserves to be said before closing. The British Empire was not a project of a distant elite acting upon an ignorant English population. It was a national project that involved millions of English people from all social classes. The rank-and-file soldiers who fought in India, Africa, and the Pacific were sons of miners, farmers, and factory workers who found in the colonial army a form of social advancement impossible at home. The missionaries who went to the colonies to convert the natives genuinely believed in what they were doing. The colonial officials who administered enormous territories with handfuls of men convinced themselves that their work was necessary and beneficial, and the population back home benefited from the empire directly or indirectly through the price of sugar, tea, cotton, and rubber that made their standard of living possible. The empire was in every sense a collective project, and its legacy is in every sense a collective responsibility. What we do with that responsibility, how we talk about it, how do we teach it, what do we claim, and what do we acknowledge? It is one of the most uncomfortable and most necessary debates in contemporary British culture. The statues being torn down, the squares being renamed, the museums debating what to do with their collections, the conversations about reparations that some former colonies are raising. All of that is part of a reckoning with a history that is not yet over, because the British Empire formally ended when the last flag was lowered, but its consequences on the borders of the world, on the economies of the countries it ruled, and on the identities of those of us descended from those who suffered under it, or built it, those consequences